So let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to actually start with telling you a story. I was on a radio station in in your area in Brattleboro recently, and I told this story there, a kind of condensed version of it. So if you happen to tune into that station and hear it, we're starting off with that again, kind of just as an object lesson for exploring some of the big ideas we're going to cover today. We're looking at all this from the lens of Christian Science, this approach to Christianity, to prayer, to healing, and any just of those big kind of concepts like prayer and healing and God. We're going to just unpack along the way as we explore these big ideas and how they relate to the stories I'm going to tell you and to the stuff we're thinking about. So the story starts out, it's a few years back. I was attending a large multi-day conference. There was a few thousand people there, and it had all gone pretty well. We got to the very last day, and it was an open Q&A time with the organizers. Somebody asked a question in that time period that turned out to be kind of controversial. I think it was certainly something that some people there were really passionate about. There was others like me who weren't necessarily for or against and maybe just hadn't really thought about it a whole lot. But what happened was, as this question was asked, the first organizer tried to answer it. And the answer frustrated people. I don't know if it just felt like they were dodging the question or it just wasn't satisfactory, but the second organizer tried to answer it, and it only seemed to exacerbate the frustration. And the frustration was starting to turn into anger, and that anger was starting to spread throughout this audience. Now, if you've ever been at a ball game or something, when people go around and all do the wave together, it was a little like that, except not nice and kind of involuntary. When the wave's going around, you have to decide, am I going to be part of this or not? What started to happen was this group reaction, this kind of mentality, almost a mob mentality, as the third organizer, the fourth organizer stood up and tried to answer this question, and it seemed to just make things worse. At some point, I actually didn't really realize I was swept up in it until after it was over. But I think I can only imagine what it was like to be on stage and see thousands of people starting to get extremely riled up. The fifth organizer stood up. And this woman took a kind of different tact. She started to talk about love, and she started to talk about it in a way that it wasn't just surfacey kind of love. It was a love that I think maybe all of us, certainly many of us in the audience, started to really feel. It was like, as she stood up and just loved on this audience and talked about love, it was like this mob mentality that had swelled up was deflated. I said in the radio interview, it was like putting a pin in a balloon, but not like a violent burst, just sort of something that just almost instantaneously let the air out, but in a kind of natural, harmonious way. That's the moment I remember waking up kind of and being like, wow, I really was swept up in that. This wasn't even an issue I was passionate about, but I was feeling angry. I was feeling frustration, all these same things everyone else was. Now I was feeling loved. Now I was feeling awake. It felt like coming out of a dream. I actually thought about it kind of as hypnotism. I'd never been hypnotized before, but if you see people on stage in those kind of comedian acts and stuff, some people talk about kind of not really knowing what they're doing. That's what it was kind of like. It was sort of like waking up from a hypnotic kind of thought, coming back to where I was and who I was and what I really thought and believed. I've talked to that lady since that day, and I know the issue didn't go away. There was still stuff to think through. There was still stuff to work on, but it definitely put the people there in a different frame of mind that was a lot more constructive for working through that issue. And the woman, she's actually a Christian Scientist. She talked a little bit about just how she was praying through that. You can imagine being up there and looking out at that audience. It's got to take more than just words. Somebody could say the right words, but if the real vision, if the genuine seeing of that audience in a light that's probably different than the way it appears to be coming at you isn't there. If you don't have that, then it's not real. I don't think it could do what happened that day. So I was really interested to hear her take on that. We're going to pause there on that story. That's just the very tip of our discussion. And I want to just kind of look at that for a second, about, how thought gets swept up sometimes, and also how taking a step back from that and having a deeper vision can help either you or others kind of wake up and think about how to go through things in a better way. Well, I want to ground that, though, in just by starting to talk about prayer. In the Bible, Jesus is asked, how do you pray? Now, this woman was praying, and we're going to talk a lot about prayer today and its role in all of this. And there are many ways to pray, and that's great. If we look at how Jesus responded when he was asked by his friends, his disciples, how do you pray? The first thing he says is, go into your closet. And he's talking about get beyond the appearance of things. He's saying, don't pray for the way it looks to other people. Don't let this be about the surface act. It's about what's going on a deeper level, in thought, in heart. I think you could say there's a lot of surface level stuff that sometimes we need to take a step back from, whether it's the opinions of others, maybe it's even our own opinions, our own frustrations, our knee-jerk reaction to things. We all have that sometimes. And just the way things tend to look on the surface, that sometimes when you plunge deeper, you realize, okay, there's more to the story. So Jesus starts out his response about how do you pray by saying, take a step back. And then he gives what many Christians today call the Lord's Prayer. We're not going to unpack all of that, but he talks about the nature of God. He talks about our relationship with God, and he talks about what that means in our lives. So if we're looking at the role of prayer, in that story, but in a broader context as we go forward tonight, and we're looking at the way Jesus described it, take a step back from fear, reaction, look at the nature of God and our relationship to God, then probably the next thing that's worth talking about a little bit is God. If the point of prayer is to get focused on the nature of God, what is that? God, again, is a huge subject, and there are many ways to think about God's nature. And being a literally infinite subject, that's okay too. As a starting point, to look back at what the Bible says. Again, Jesus talks about God as spirit, as one word that Jesus used. And spirit is a word that can feel pretty abstract. It can feel pretty separate from where we are today, what's practical, what's needed, what's tangible, what's really useful. But the word spirit is just a translation, right? And the word that Jesus used in Hebrew, or as it was translated in Greek too, is actually means wind or breath. It's the same word in Greek. That word spirit is translated to breath or wind in Greek, just as it is in Hebrew. And if you think about the wind, the air, Jesus talking about God is like the air. That's something that's all around you, right? That's something that's ever present. It's something that you don't see, but it does matter. and it is a thing. If you think about the wind isn't maybe something you see, but you see the effect of the wind. That's a way Jesus talked about that analogy, actually, as he talked about spirit. He says, you don't see where the wind comes from or where it goes, but you see the leaves moving in the trees, for example. So God is maybe not a see, but God is this ever-present feel that is a cause that has a reaction, an effect. Other ways the Bible talks about God is as love and as truth itself, as life itself. Well, if you think about those things, none of those things are really things you see. You don't see love, but you can see love expressed. You can see it in acts of kindness and generosity, charity, patience. You can see truth expressed in acts of integrity and honesty. Life, you see life expressed, made manifest in things. So God is not a sea, but it's maybe not an irrelevant thing. Like breath, maybe you don't think about it much, or air, but you kind of know it if it wasn't there. Like if your breath got taken away, you'd be keenly aware of that. In fact, the Bible says that God made everything that was made, and nothing was made that God didn't make. And that God is of purer eyes than to behold evil. God is pure good. And one last one I'll touch on. The Bible talks about the same fountain not sending forth both fresh water and salty water. So you get this idea of God as like a cause, as maker, as creator, not as a tribal deity up in the clouds somewhere, but as life itself and as truth itself and love itself. Now, throughout the Bible, the Bible is written by a lot of different people, men, women, rich, poor, even different ideas about God. And you see an evolving idea of God there. There are folks there who still think of God in that tribal way. My God that protects me and destroys you. But you see this evolution of the people's idea of God getting clearer and clearer. And even where there's, other stuff mixed in, there's still progress in every story you hear about where somebody's idea of God has a tangible impact in their life for the better. We'll come back to that in a second. But it culminates in the life of Jesus. It culminates, when you start reading about God in this broader, bigger, deeper, more eternal way, as love itself, not as like a human personality that, sends good and evil. The same fountain can't send forth both fresh water and salty water. So life can't send death, destruction. Love can't send hate, division, fear. Truth can't send ignorance and false information, and so on. So there's this idea of this ever-present, all-embracing, universal, eternal source, which is the cause of everything, the kind of principle of the universe. What is truly normal, what is truly natural, flows from this pure source of good. That's more than just theology. It's going to tie into the basis of everything we talk about. It ties into who we are, as Jesus said when he talked about the Lord's Prayer and our relationship to God. So a God like that, what does it mean that we have a relationship with a God like that? What is our relationship? Well, this idea is pretty big. It's the first thing the Bible ever says about who we are and our relationship with God is that we're made in the very likeness of God. That's on like page 2 of the Bible in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. First thing that's said about us, we're made in the likeness of God. And that's a theme that runs throughout. It's not one obscure passage. Jesus talked about being perfect as God is perfect. And Jesus' follower, Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians in the Bible, talked about putting off this old sense of ourselves and putting on a new sense of ourselves, created to be like God, like God's nature, not like God's, but with the same quality, the same characteristic, the same kind of spiritual DNA, if you will. Because if God is the cause of everything and we are the outgrowth, the outcome of God, then our nature is built out of God's nature, built out of what is purely good. I want to read you one line here from the book of Isaiah in the Hebrew scriptures. This is the Hebrew prophet, and he's writing like in the voice of God speaking to us. And he says, "Bring my sons from far away and my daughters from the end of the earth, everyone who's called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made." So sons from far away, daughters from the ends of the earth, that's everybody, right? Everybody's included in that. I was actually reading another passage in the Bible earlier today that talks about bring my people from the west and my people from the east, and I will care for them. We have this feeling of division, right and left and that kind of thing, but the Bible uses this language all throughout, really. The God of all life, the God of all individuality, the God of all, all of us, of who we are. So it's about everybody, but created and formed by God. It's good if we're talking about this kind of a God. But the purpose, did you hear the purpose word? It says made for God's glory. Now, to glorify something means to make something known. That's one definition anyway. To make God known, you could make God known by going and talking about God. You could go out on the street corner and shout about God. But this is not talking about what you say. It's not even really talking about what we do. It's talking about who we are. It's talking about our being. So we exist to make God known. Again, you don't see love, but you see the effect of love. If there were no effect, you wouldn't know love was even there. We expect to be there to be a tangible outcome or effect when somebody loves. And it's the same thing with God. There is an outcome, there is an effect, and that the Bible says is us. We are the outcome, the effect of God. We are built to be the place where God's nature shines through. We have purpose. We are inherently useful, not in cookie cutter kind of ways, but because our source is infinite, in ways that uniquely expresses the nature of God, but always with the same building blocks: inherently good, intelligent, peaceable, honest, valuable, whole, and healthy. So whatever is like the nature of God is inherent to how we're meant to be. So Jesus maps that out as a way to pray. Take a step back from the fear and knee-jerk reactions, get focused on the nature of God and our relationship to God. But here's where we have to start talking about really connecting the dots, because hopefully those ideas, resonate with you. But they certainly can feel really different, really separate from where we are, from the stuff we deal with, from who we are, from who the other people around us might seem to be. So how do we get there? What does that mean? How do we connect some dots here? What use is any of this? So this is where the word discovery comes in. And of course, this is our theme tonight: spiritual discovery, how we can better the world. But discovery, spirituality is often relegated to this realm of maybe just positive thinking, or sometimes more like as that which dumbs you down and causes you to ignore stuff around you and just kind of, be almost, put to sleep or something. And so discovery, though, is very different than even the best of those ideas. Discovery is not just positive thinking, right? Discovery implies that something is there. It doesn't really matter if you think positively about it or not. You could be pretty skeptical. In fact, a lot of scientists are pretty skeptical, and they take that critical thinking to discover law, what is real, and to understand it in a way that helps them build and prove something new. Discovery implies that something is there. The laws of aerodynamics, for example, were discovered. And of the various people who were working out flight at the same time as the Wright brothers, not one of them went up onto a tall hill and just thought positively about flying and then jumped off. Each was trying to understand these laws that were universal, that applied to everybody equally. The Wright brothers understood it best at that time, and so they were credited with discovery, but they didn't create those laws. And the more they understood it, the more anyone has understood those laws throughout time. Of course, that idea has evolved and been understood more and more. We've been able to build better things with that. Discovery takes place on a lot of forms, though. Whatever breaks through in human consciousness and reveals something that is normal, natural, good, even very contrary to the way things have appeared to be or the way things have played out, I'd call that a discovery. It can happen on a social level, political level, any kind of a level. I would say discovery is what really has progressed humanity throughout human history. We can look back at anything as a new idea that comes to fruition. So here's another example that relates to our times, and certainly yesterday with Dr. Martin Luther King. You can look back at the way women and people of color in this country have been treated throughout our history, and still today. You can see progress, but let's look back, 100 years, 150 years. Let's look at people who were enslaved, or look at the status of women in, say, the mid 1800s. Black Americans, women were considered to be lesser human beings, actually less developed human beings from many things that I've read, less developed men, like, on their way there, but didn't make it to being fully developed. And was that ever true? No, but it was the general perception in this country, from what I understand. Certainly, our laws were built around that perception. We treated each other based on that perception. And so, what happened? Did we take actually, literally lesser people and then turn them into real equal people? Or did public thought start to evolve? Did the true idea start to come to the surface, be understood, be acted on more? And did the laws begin to reflect a better understanding of what had always been true as slavery was officially ended, as more people got the right to vote, as it has evolved through the life of Dr. King, through people like the Little Rock Nine, those students who went in and stood for something that had always been true, but was very contrary to the way things had appeared to be, been thought to be, and so on. Discovery, one of the characteristics of discovery is that it does fly in the face of the way things appear to be. You could look at people who have been enslaved and you could say, see, they're not as smart. Or, are you looking at the effect of the way you think, or are you looking at what is actually true? If you mistake cause and effect, it can be really harmful. If you look at people as unequal because they've been held down and treated to be unequal, then that's the effect of your perception, not an actuality. And here's what's really important about this in regard to healing, because sometimes when we talk about healing, especially the kind of healing that you see in the Bible, where people who are, in the middle of war find safety, and the people in the middle of famine find food and water, and the people who had been outcasts from society find community again, and the people who were thought to be incurable find health and wholeness again. Each of these, because in the midst of these moments, they have some inspiration rooted in their idea of God, their biggest and best idea of God in that moment. And it transforms their view. It transforms how they see things. And then there's this effect that comes. Well, again, we can look at that and it can sound, like pie in the sky stuff. It can also sound, as you start to try and apply it to today, like, well, if you just look to God, if you're talking about just stepping back from a problem and looking to what God is, then you're ignoring the issue. But let's look at, if you look at someone who's thought to be unequal, and you take a step back from that general belief, and you look at what helps inform you more as to who they really are. Is that helping or hindering? Is that pie in the sky, or is that a necessary step for evolution? If, on the other hand, you start with the surface appearance of things and you say, see, unequal, let's fix that. Even with the greatest intentions, trying to fix something that isn't actually what you believe it to be isn't going to get you very far. What steps do you take to turn an unequal person into an equal person? You can't. You have to discover that they're already equal, and then that informed point of view has to help you know what to do next. To me, that's what discovery is about. What is already there? What is already going on? To me, that's what genuine healing is about. That's what Jesus is talking about when he says, take a step back and look at the nature of God. It's not just positive thinking to make us feel better while the ship goes down. It's to step back from what gets our goat and the perceptions that we have about ourselves, about others, about the way the world works, and to look at the nature of God to say, what is actually normal and natural? How does that inform me? How does that inform how I see others? How do I act on that? It leads to different kind of results. But in every case, discovery is a mental process first. Because you don't first see planes flying through the sky, you don't first see equal people with rights and so on, you have to be able to take a mental journey first. The concept has to shift. If that concept is rooted in what is actual and true, again, then you can build on it, and you have to test it. It can't just become a theory. It's about living it. But just because it's mental doesn't mean it's not actual. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have tangible results. And so when we look at spirituality and we say, well, this is just something going on in my thought, if I'm taking a step back and thinking about God, that's just in my thinking. That doesn't have anything to do with what's going on out there. Well, every discovery that has progressed humanity and human history started that way. It started with a shift in thought that informed our actions. And that thought, when it's true, it spreads. Because when people hear what's true, they kind of go, oh yeah, maybe not at first. Any of those examples we've already given, there was resistance. There's resistance to the idea that the sun didn't go around the earth. And yet truth has a way of just spreading. It has a way of bringing light to darkness, and darkness doesn't really have a way to fight back. If you've ever put a candle in a room or turn on a little light, anyone ever seen darkness push it out and say, no, it's not a thing. Ignorance, fear, misunderstanding, misperception is not a power. It can sure seem that way, and we can suffer from the effects of those misperceptions. Humanity has struggled with all its sufferings rooted in that, but as we discover new ideas, those sufferings are put off. Humanity moves forward. And to me, that's what genuine healing is about on every level. All the different little ways we see it happening in the Bible, whether it's physical healing in regard to our health, we'll talk more about that in a moment, or any of these other forms of healing in regard to community and safety and so on. To me, that's what we're talking about today. And I have one more little analogy I want to share with you about this. If I wrote 7 plus 3 on a board, and you would all know the answer, right? 7 plus 3 equals what? 73. No. 7 and 3 equals 10. But if you don't know math, if you only have a surface understanding, like you think the plus just means you put them together. I mean, plus does mean you put them together, but conceptually, not really physically, right? 7 and 3 together is not 73. If you don't know that, there's a certain surface level logic. If you don't know the real principle behind the way things work, if you only have a surface level logic, 7 and 3 comes together, that means 73. Well, try and do your grocery shopping with that math, you're not going to get very far or much of anything else. As you understand the principle, it helps you do the math right, and the results bring less suffering. The results are better. When we look out in the world and we're trying to connect the dots between these big ideas of what God is, what our nature is, we're talking about, plunging beneath just the surface appearance, the reactions, the fears, the opinions, and getting, focused on that and saying, okay, there can be an effect from that. Hopefully that makes at least some sense at this point. The next question is always, yeah, but on the surface, I see stuff that seems very logical. You can't tell me that's not actual. Well, let's look back at that angry mob, for example, or even we could look at what we've already talked about and then go to the angry mob. When we talked about looking at people that appear to be unequal. On the surface level logic is see the color of their skin, see their gender, see how they don't seem as educated and smart or whatever. See, the surface level logic dictates it must be true. That's the effect of misunderstanding, not the effect of an actual principle at work. And you could say the same thing about this angry mob, right? This woman was standing there. She was looking out at this audience. The surface level logic says there's a difficult issue that we have to deal with. It's a legitimate issue. What has been said has made these people angry. And now I have 3,000 angry people in front of me. You could start there. You could start with that kind of 7 plus 3 equals 73 and then try and fix it. Or you could take a step back from that and get a deeper perspective of things. Now, that woman, as she talked about praying through this, that prayer meant step back from what that looks like, take a step back from the way that makes you feel at first, your knee-jerk reaction to that. That doesn't mean ignore it. It just means Set it on the table long enough to find a view rooted in something more meaningful that's going to make a bigger difference than just your surface view. This woman looks out, and as she thinks about God's nature and how that defines every person in that audience, regardless of where they're coming from, regardless of their age, regardless of their different views, where they're from in the country, all that kind of stuff, she begins to see people who are made intelligent, people who are made cool-headed, people who are made full of love, people, because their nature reflects that, made for the glory of God. That's what's built into them. It doesn't look that way. I've got no reason to believe that. Goodness is there, respect is there, fairness is there, justice is there, harmony is there. That's a mental journey, because nothing you're going to see on the surface looks that way. But that mental journey is like discovering something. It's bringing it into view. It's beginning to perceive it. It informs the way you think, you see, you act, the basis on which you're going to reason. Just like 7 + 3 = 10, contrary to the surface appearance, but it informs the way you do the equation. And the result is good. This woman looks out, and the truth that is brought to the situation, the love that is brought to the situation, that has the power. It's not the person that has the power. It's the truth itself, that as it is brought into the same room with falsity, love brought into the same room with anger and frustration, like light being brought into the room with darkness, there's not really combat. There's just what is. When it seems like there's a fight, it's because falsity hasn't been self-seen yet. That is, the light hasn't fully dawned in that space yet. But it's not that truth is weak. It's not that love doesn't have as much power and there's a real combat. So that discovery of what is true and bringing that into that space is what casts out what is not natural in that place. We all kind of woke up to who we were more naturally made to be. That's something we can apply. Hopefully you're seeing some links here already as we look out, we think about, the folks we see on the news, whether they seem to be on one side or the other side. We have a kind of common enemy here, and that is whatever distorts our view. I mean, any of us, anywhere, of what is really normal and natural, what is really good. We all get tempted. We all become afraid at times. And so that's the enemy. It's not a person over there. Ignorance, falsity is the enemy. Jesus talked about this word in the Bible. It gets said different ways: deceiver, accuser, tempter, devil, not as a person, but as a lie, and the father of itself. No real source. Just that which we have to contend with. We can't say it's not there. We can't say the lie just doesn't exist. But we can't treat it like it's a truth that we have to fight with some other truth. When we look out and we see what divides us, what binds us up, what terrifies us, what causes us to experience anything other than what naturally flows from the nature of God, we can boil it down to a common enemy, modes of thought, impressions, ideas, elements, characteristics that are really common. They play out in different ways. They have different clothes, some person's afraid because of this. Some person's afraid because of that. Some person feels like fairness and love are on the line. And another person feels like, justice and order are on the line. But the common enemy there is fear that distorts the view and causes us to actually think these are separate things, when love and justice, principle, and truth all come from the same source. We're actually one in what we're looking for. It doesn't seem like it, but that's the misconception, and the misconception is the enemy. Again, not a person, not a evil intelligence, because there can't be something apart from a God that is ever present, like the air, everywhere, pure good, pure love. But a negation, like darkness, not a thing, not a presence, but something that, we have to deal with if it's dark in the room, but we deal with it by turning on the light. Light can be brought to the equation when we're not tricked by that surface level logic into hating ourselves, hating other people, thinking lesser of ourselves than what God sees and what God knows, or of other people, or of what is normal in the way things really function, in the way society, community, even government really functions. The true qualities and characteristics of God that are the root of all that is normal and natural, all that has actual power and presence. It's the same source for all of us. So how do we do this? Let's just keep looking at that. The word Christ is important here. Christ, wasn't just the last name of Jesus. It was a title given to him that meant the anointed one, Messiah. It meant Emmanuel, God with us. It symbolized that presence and activity, that brightness and brilliance of God that shone through his life, shone through his love, his healing, his teachings, his example. That same presence of God that shone through Jesus' life so brilliantly, Jesus also showed us is ever present. The presence and activity of God made manifest in our lives, as it was made manifest in the life of Jesus, is an eternal thing. It is always with us. It's the work of truth. It's the power of truth at work in human thought. It is the power of love itself at work in human thought. Sometimes it reaches us through a person, an inspirational book we read or something. But there's other times you've probably had those moments. We call them like aha moments, where something just breaks through. And the power is in the truth itself behind that idea. That is what orders the universe. That is what is flows from the Creator. Jesus showed us something about the nature of grace, that is the love of God, which is freely given, that we don't earn, we don't work our way up to. He showed us the power of grace, the power of that love, that the way it reaches people wherever they are, whatever they're thinking, whatever they've thought before, if they're in the middle of hate, if they're in the middle of fear, if they feel, forgotten and helpless, there, that's grace. There, love meets us when we don't even feel like we know how to think better for ourselves. There, when it seems we don't deserve it, we've done something wrong. There, right there, what is revealed is more of who we really are. Right there, that revelation of what is true has the power to overturn what is not true, to bring out more of what is true. Jesus helped people from all backgrounds through grace. Jesus showed us something too about the nature of salvation, which I guess in a short phrase we could say is that discovery or that revelation that nothing can separate us from the grace of God. Nothing can. Nothing has the power to do that. Anything any more than something has the power to come along and turn 7 plus 3 into something other than 10. Not only can it not be turned into 73, it can't be turned into 10.1, not even a little bit off. It is an exact fact, as is our nature and the nature of reality, really, life itself. This true idea of God reaches us in all ways. I'll tell you another quick story. A family called me one time, a mom of a family, 3 little kids and a dad. They were on a road trip together, and they were driving cross country. They decided to stay with a family member. When they got there, they found out that family had been really sick with the flu. This was a few years back, and they needed to stay there that day, and then they were going to head out the next day. But after spending some time there, and as they were getting ready to go to bed, this is when the mom was calling me, and she was saying, all three of my kids, my husband and I, all are starting to feel these initial symptoms of what feel like the flu coming on. We've experienced this before, and it just kind of like, when I feel this, I kind of know what it's going to be like the next day. She was asking if we could pray together. Well, we talked a little bit about something Paul says in the Bible about God being the atmosphere in which we live and move and have our being, and God being love. So love being our actual atmosphere where we live and move and have our being. Now, surface level logic here, like 7 + 3 = 73. Surface level logic would say you walk into a contagious environment, you start to feel symptoms, you're going to be sick, you are sick. But the beyond the surface look at that is we're made in the likeness of God. What truly defines us is God's nature, which is love itself. That's our entire atmosphere. It is in love that we're actually breathing and being in the most spiritual kind of sense of that. That the cause is pure. The cause of our health, the cause of our well-being is pure goodness. And even if it looks like there's a surface logic and a result, which you can feel, right there we have the right to challenge what is unlike the nature of God and discover more of our innate, unchangeable nature. We're not fixing a person who caught a sickness and turning them into a person who doesn't have one through some kind of magic juju. It's about discovering what is here now, kind of waking up, like in that group situation I told you about. You feel it. You can't just say it's not there, but at the same time, when you wake up from it, it's like, oh, that was never actually me. In a way, it wasn't even my thought or my life or my health. Well, we talked about that. They went to bed. I prayed kind of along the lines we've talked about. The next morning, this mom called me and she said, hey, look, we're all piling into the car. We're getting ready to go. I want to tell you, all the symptoms are gone. Kids are bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. We all feel great. And she said, on the one hand, it feels kind of miraculous because I've never gone from feeling this way the night before to just having it evaporate. But she said it also just feels normal. It's just us, feels natural. And they went on with their road trip and they were fine. God's love is not compartmentalized. We tend to break it down, and whether it's in, by group, my group or your group, or these kinds of situations, but that's a really big situation. That doesn't apply there. I wish it did, but it doesn't. Or stuff that is more, physical versus stuff that is mental and emotional. And as we get a notion of God's nature and what this means about us, the first tendency is to let it be compartmentalized and say, well, I see how it could help me in some ways. But to start to see that this is the whole of life, this is the whole of what is normal and natural, is a pretty big and wonderful wake-up call. That really is grace. That's the love that is unearned, that is comprehensive, that is unconditional. No compartmentalization or conditions, is already there. You can't get more freely given than it's already yours. Here it is. And then that idea of truth and love that meets us wherever we are and wakes us up to that. Now, a little bit like, looking at some of those situations in history we talked about, when we look today at the pandemic and somebody hears a story like this, it'd be natural enough to say, okay, so you're talking about looking beneath the surface, but does that mean then you just ignore it? Well, hopefully by now you see that's not what we're talking about. And discovering more about the nature of God is not in conflict with, good civic duty, the golden rule, good neighborliness. Jesus talked about God as spirit, but then also gave the golden rule. These are not in conflict with one another. One is the natural outgrowth of the other. They work in concert with one another. Nobody has to give up their freedom, their rights to love their neighbor, to work in concert with society. Sometimes when people hear that somebody approaching their life this way from this Christian Science standpoint might pray as a first line of defense in any situation, might say, well, but does then that make you a danger to society, or does that mean you're anti something, anti the good work that other people are doing to try and bring, help to the rest of society, or anti-vaccine. And it's not an anti anything. Anyone who's approaching their life this way, they might not feel they're going to get the best help from a vaccine, but they're also not afraid of it. They're not anti it. That wouldn't make sense, right? It's whatever meets people's thought where it is. That's encouraged. It's supported, and we work together through love in taking steps forward in society. But we see that there just is no conflict in any of that. There's no compartmentalization in God's love. God's love is meeting everyone in just the way we need it to, and not at the sacrifice of someone else. That's often the catcher when we start to feel like, I like this idea, but it means someone else is gonna, my good is on the line. They could take my good, or something like that. Step by step is just a key here as we think about that nature of Christ, that true idea that meets us where we are. It's great when we can see 100 steps in front of us. I know right now, a lot of people in regard to the pandemic, as in regard to governmental transition, regardless of where you're coming from, there's a lot of questions. What's going to happen tomorrow? What's going to happen a week from now? What's going to happen 6 months from now? This true idea that reaches us right where we are, we might not always be able to see far in advance, but at no point is blind faith required in any of this. What we're talking about is right now, at any given moment, we can reach out. We can make these discoveries. What do I need to know right now? What does the nature of God do to inform me about who I am and what's going on right at this moment in my thinking, in the steps I need to take, and the things that I need to do? How does that uplift and transform through grace my sense of things? Then how does it do that in an hour? How does it do that later tonight? How does it do that tomorrow? The thing about being able to take things step by step, even when we can't see down the road, it doesn't mean we never can, but sometimes we can't, is that as long as what we're discovering is rooted in the nature of God, that means we are on the right path, because there's no path that's better. And as long as we're on the right path, then really all we need to know is that we're on the step that we need to be on right now, because that is the step that leads to the next one. If you're on the right path, the step that leads to the next right step is the right step right now, right? And then that step is the step that leads to the next one. Without blind faith, with just kind of general reason here, we can understand that as long as we're on the right step right now at any given moment, that is always the next step on the path that leads us to where we need to go. There's a lot of questions too about things like the economy opening up and so on. There is no area of our life where we can't be informed by the nature of God. We've been speaking in broad brushstrokes just to talk about how this works and what this is. But the specifics are rich and beautiful as we reach out and look to the nature of God. It's not just general ideas, platitudes, trying to affirm something and believe in it. It's really looking at this infinite nature of God, and it has just specific relevance to wherever we are and whatever we're thinking about and dealing with at any given time. Mary Baker Eddy is the founder of this movement, the Christian Science movement. That she lived in the 1800s into the 1900s, and the movement has been a movement of healing from the beginning. It was always a kind of grassroots movement of folks who were helped by what they were learning, helped other people. Those people turned around and helped others. It was never a hierarchical kind of thing. And that's how it spread. Mary Baker Eddy felt she discovered something significant in her life. She found transformation and healing from chronic illness that she had dealt with from the time she was a little girl, healing from a severe accident that many people didn't expect her to recover from, and freedom from many of the expectations of her time. She felt that she made this big kind of discovery about this approach to Christianity, this way of looking at the teachings of Jesus and saying whatever is true has to be eternally true. Whatever is true has to be understandable, has to be repeatable, has to be provable. What if we look at it that way? What if we connect the dots instead of having a blind faith? What she discovered is what she felt transformed her life. And this kind of big moment of discovery in her life, well, one of them happened a year after the Civil War. She was right there in the midst of a lot of upheaval and difficulty. She had family members that fought in the war. She, as a woman, didn't have a whole lot of rights herself. This woman felt her life was empowered by what we're talking about tonight, as she felt anybody's life, everybody's life is empowered the more we discover it and live it. At a time when women, it was literally considered immoral to speak publicly. She was preaching and lecturing in halls from Chicago to around the East Coast, Boston, at a time when women, couldn't vote or weren't thought to have any kind of business acumen. And in her 87th year, she started an international newspaper called the Christian Science Monitor. She pioneered copyright, laws. She bucked the perceptions of the time, not really in a, like, I want to prove something kind of way, but more in a, hey, this is just the natural result of discovering more of who we are kind of a way. It just empowers you. It is not a personal power. It is the power that moves us, that benefits us, that helps us break through misperceptions, helps us break through fears, helps us break through false limitations, glass ceilings, whatever you want to call it, whether it's in our own lives or in the perceptions of society around us. The science of Christ has never been about just a self-help system or personal kind of alternative medicine or a religion. It's always been about the nature of life and how it works and how that informs all of society, how that helps us experience more of truth, more of life, more of love everywhere, and help our neighbors do the same. Mary Baker Eddy felt that this was something Jesus talked about, something Jesus had said would happen. He talked about, whoever follows me will do the same works that I do. He talked about a comforter coming, which other Bibles translate, the King James calls it comforter. Some Bibles call it a helper or an advocate. But Jesus defined it. He said, it's the Spirit of truth that's going to explain all things, that's going to help you remember what I taught you and bring you into all truth. That Spirit of truth that is here, just showing all of humanity the way, is not a religion. People might not think about it in the same terms or the same words, but a rose under any other name is just as sweet, right? Doesn't matter if you call 7 + 3 73 or you say it in French or Spanish, it's the same principle. That's the deal. That's what the science of Christ is. It's about that principle that sets us free the more we understand and build on it. Mary Baker Eddy wrote this book called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And this explains Christian Science. The last 100 pages of the book are all people who were healed significantly, in many cases of diagnosed problems that were considered incurable because of what they were discovering spiritually and the impact that had on their lives. I want to read you a passage from this book. She starts, by the way, by saying the time for thinkers has come. I like that. I imagine we can all resonate with that right now. Not caught up in reactions, not caught up in compartmentalized truths, but thinking rooted in discovery, what is universal and actual. In this passage, she writes, the conceptions of mortal erring thought must give way to the ideal of all that is perfect and eternal. Through many generations, human beliefs will be attaining diviner conceptions, and the immortal and perfect model of God's creation will finally be seen as the only true conception of being. She goes on, she starts the next paragraph talking about science. She's talking about the science of Christ. Science reveals the possibility of achieving all good and sets mortals at work to discover what God has already done. So we know there's stuff we need to see differently. We know there's breakthroughs that are needed. We all have a sense of what we face in our communities, in our nation, and in the world. And the promise here is that we can we can achieve good by discovering what God has already done. Again, that's grace. That's the love that is so loving that it's already here, even before you realize it, and the love that helps us realize it. As you look out, you look at the inauguration tomorrow, or you look at the pandemic, or any of the things that we still have to work through, to start from the basis that, in essence, the good that seems to be on the line or vulnerable or just blown out of the water actually is already there. You write 7 plus 73 all over the board all you want. You write it in big, scary numbers. You write it in little, subtle numbers, creepy numbers. It doesn't change the math. It doesn't change the principle. It's already there. It's quite comforting to know that the good we seek is there, and it is not my good and your good. It's the good, the good that meets us all where we are, that puts aside our fears and ignorances and lifts us up and helps us move forward, take next steps. And all of us are needed in discovering that. I'll read you a line here from the Bible too. This is from Paul. He says in the book of 1 Corinthians, "Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror, but then we will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete. But then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely." Things can seem muddled, like those clown house mirrors that are all stretched out or wobbly or something, puzzling reflections in a mirror. Yeah, we see some good and some truth, but we see all this other stuff mixed in. But what God sees is perfect. And that's the promise. People have been talking about this for a long time, and people have been living it for a long time. We look at people we think of in history as real reformers who stood on a bigger truth. It was never a personal power. It was always the way truth could transform, the truth that God already sees. I know we're right about at our time for the Q&A, but if you don't mind, I'm going to tell you one last pretty quick story, I think, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. There's a story about a grandfather who called me, excuse me, and he called me because he and his grandson had a big argument. He was at his grandson's house. His grandson was about 17 years old, and he's living with his mom. And something happened that day, something that hit the news. It was a very divisive issue. It was a couple of years ago, and the grandfather and the grandson found themselves on very different ends of the spectrum of their points of view of the situation. The grandson just was pretty livid. He couldn't believe his grandfather saw things a certain way. And so the grandfather was trying to explain and reason through his point of view. And it just made the grandson madder until the grandson just said, I don't want to talk to you anymore. And he meant it. He didn't just mean it that day. By the time the grandfather called me, it had been a year since the grandfather and grandson had spoken to each other. The grandfather had tried to hold out many olive branches and talk to his grandson, but he just kind of disowned him. And, he was hurt. He wanted to pray about it. And so we started talking together about how to get beneath the surface level actions to what was at the root of it. We have to uncover the misperception for what it is before we can just say, it's not real or something like that. To get to the root of what's real, we need to know what the lie is. Think of it like a court case. If you've been accused of something and you know that, but you just show up on the day of your court case and you say, whatever they said, I'm not guilty. How good of a defense is that? How likely is that to bring out the truth that actually sets anybody free? To understand the argument, to understand what's at the root of what the prosecution is saying, the accuser, is to be able to delve into the beautiful specifics of the truth and come prepared to bear witness to that, knowing that bearing witness to what is true allows the truth to speak for itself, and thus to have of a victory. Well, as we looked at what are the mental elements at the root of how your grandson's feeling and what was going on in the news, the grandfather started to realize there were frustrations, anger, injustice there that he hadn't been willing to acknowledge or deal with. And it actually transformed his view. He, after a few days, started saying, I get where that's coming from now. I want to do something about it. He had such a different view. He was like aching to help and to be part of the healing solution. As we talked about how to do that, we talked about how we needed to continue to go deeper. Understanding the root of the situation is one thing, but then, okay, you don't ignore that, but what is it that is going to make the difference now? What can you see, and how does that inform how you act? How does that change the way you see yourself, see others, see what has power in the world? And so as he started to look more at God's nature and where fairness and justice and equality and freedom and unity and so on come from, he realized he had more to discover about God's nature there. But as he was doing that, he felt like he was starting to get ideas about how to think about others, how to act. It wasn't just kind of a, running around saying, I want to do something. He started to get really good ideas. He also wanted to still reconcile with his grandson, but he knew his grandson wouldn't listen to him. I wouldn't even give him a moment to talk, and let alone say, hey, I've actually had a change of heart. And so we talked about how he saw his grandson. He could look out, he could see someone who was hurt, angry, and not receptive to his views at the time, his new views, or he could, and then try and convince that person, try and change that person's view, or he could discover more about who the grandson really was. What makes that grandson receptive, inherently receptive to what is good? What makes that grandson whole and safe? What makes that grandson peaceable, open, and so on? All the qualities and characteristics of God. We talked very specifically about what you and I have talked about tonight, how prayer is not, and we've touched on this, but prayer is not about trying to send out magic juju just to affect somebody. It's not actually about changing anybody. It's not a tool for imposing one's views on another person's views. It's not about manipulation of any kind. It's discovering what is already there. When we discover what's there, we see people already have the truth. We see their direct connection with it. We don't have to try and change somebody. We begin acting based on what is already true. So this was helping him have a real revelation about his grandson's true mind, character, nature, and so on. And he felt at peace. So after a week or two of talking together, writing emails, we parted. He said, thanks. And he wrote me back, though, a month or two later. And he said, the first time he went over to his daughter's house where his grandson was living, that day, his grandson came out of the room where he'd normally been locked in when his grandfather came over. And he said it just vanished. They didn't even talk it through. They just, they were kind of themselves again. Not themselves in the old way, but themselves more in the way that was truer to who they were, in a way where they could build together more constructively. So there was healing. There was healing on every level. Like I've probably said tonight too, hopefully you can connect the dots there. But it is important as we think of praying for our neighbors, ourselves, people we think we like or maybe are tempted not to like, that prayer is not a tool for looking out and seeing folks who we think don't get it and are dumb or whatever worse, and trying to use that like a power to change folks. It takes a lot of humility to pray this way. Jesus showed the might of meekness, the might of grace, the power of truth itself to uplift and unify us, to show us we're actually, have a common good, and we have a common enemy, which is, falsity. Shows us that the power is in the light, the light that is the light for all. And the way our prayers make a difference for our communities, even when we're not out there shouting about it, is our thought, our hearts is where the light shines through. Even when we don't get the chance to talk to somebody, like the grandfather didn't get the chance to talk to his grandson. Even then, anyone who's in the atmosphere of our prayer, who's in our thought, who, we're aware of, it's like being in the same room in a way, in the same community. We are kind of in the same room of thought. And discovering more of what is true allows that power of universal truth and love to shine through. That light is what uplifts the tide, what uplifts the atmosphere of thought. That's the leaven. Jesus talked about an analogy of the leaven leavening the whole lump. It doesn't take a lot, but it does. You put yeast into dough and it does its work. It does what it needs to do. Not because you just hope it will, but because when you put yeast in dough, it does something. There is an effect from that cause. The effect of the light at work in our consciousness, in our views of others, enlightens the whole atmosphere of thought. It makes a difference, and it heals. Somebody has asked the question, how do we as a nation begin to resolve the enigma of subjective, in quotes, truth, or truth according to whichever political narrative one sides with, instead of working from a common basis? That's a really good question. You may have heard the phrase a post-truth world. People are starting to feel like, we're compartmentalized in our lives and in our streams of information, and only getting that information from one source, and it shapes and reinforces a certain view. And you also hear people talking about how important it is then to actually talk to people of other views and try and, listen to each other and so forth. Those are great, outward activities that help. But to get to that deeper point of view, let's look at the story of the grandfather and the grandson. And I can tell you this would apply to any of the stories that we told tonight. What is it that transformed people's views, whether it was the woman standing in front of the audience, or it was the family that called, or the grandfather and the grandson? In the first two stories, there was some communication. I was able to talk to the mom, the woman was able to talk to the crowd. And so you'd say there was an ability to come together on what was true. But I would argue that the outward talking wasn't actually the primary factor. And in the case of the grandfather and the grandson, it was not a factor at all. I would say that as we take a step back in our prayers and we acknowledge that truth is ever present, because God is ever present, that is so, so needed right now. That on the surface logic is truth can be compartmentalized, separated, divided, set into separate streams. There's all kinds of detailed reasons why one can end up with one very different view than another view. And then you feel helpless. You feel helpless based on that surface level logic to say, how could we ever work through this? But that's not the end of the story. That is a surface level logic, but how do we deal with it? That's like what the prosecution is arguing. But the defense, Christ, that truth that meets us where we are, says, throughout human history, there has been a present activity. Truth is not inert. Truth is not just waiting for somebody to do something with it. Truth is being God. God is truth. Truth is living. Truth is ever present. Truth is always acting. Therefore, truth is always communicating. Truth is always uplifting, leavening. And folks in dark places can be met with light. There are so many wonderful stories. I had a friend who was laying on the floor in her room. She'd been in a band and doing drugs and had OD'd. And, there was no surface level new stream of information meeting her. But right there came light, came this whole new sense of who she was, what God was, and so on. I've had people who have told me they've had experiences like that, and then later on heard something like what we're talking about tonight and been like, oh, that's what happened. So they didn't hear about it first, they experienced it first. To understand the nature of truth is really essential here. Truth is not, again, like I said, just waiting for somebody to get it right on the surface so that they can have access to it. It is a living, palpitating presence that has more power than falsity. To discover that, to really begin to chew on that, and to look more at the nature of God in a way that helps us genuinely see it, is a powerful prayer that is needed. That truth itself unifies us, even when it seems we won't listen to each other and there's surface reasons for it to be different. I know that's just one idea. Looking at what's true again also leads to footsteps sometimes. Conversations you didn't expect you could have, ways of reaching out. There are wonderful examples of that too. But you start with what's true, and whether it leads to an outward action or not, the more we discover what's true, the more that light shines through and has the power to transform. It's a big idea. Hopefully it's helpful. Someone is talking about the Christian Science Bible lesson this week. In Christian Science churches, there's a weekly Bible lesson that is read. There's no personal preachers or pastors in a Christian Science church, and so this Bible lesson is put together, and someone's elected from the congregation to read it. So someone's asking a question about this Bible lesson on truth this week, and saying truth is a synonym of God, and saying, yet, what is truth when humanity, people are defining it? So I'm going to try and understand that. There's more to the question. 1 + 2 = 2. This is true wherever one is. What if someone believes it to be 3? To them, it's true. This is my question. Then how can we know? We know what is truly true and know that it is, in fact, the truth. That's a great question. Actually, I studied philosophy in college. That's what I got my degree in, my undergrad degree, which is not to say I have an advanced degree. And what you're talking about fits into what philosophers would call epistemology. How do you know what you know? How do you know what is true or not? People have tried to rationalize through that from a philosophical standpoint for a long time. If we put it to the litmus test Jesus gave, Jesus would say, you know the tree by its fruit. So if you do the math equation of 1 + 1 = 3, and you believe it and you have a great argument for it, everyone around you believes it, but your results are always a little skewed, then if you have enough humility to pay attention, you start to notice that. And so humility, I mentioned the word meekness is really key here. Meekness is a word that Jesus used when he gave what has been now compiled and put together and known as the Sermon on the Mount. He starts out not by saying you have to know everything. He starts out by saying you need to hunger and thirst after righteousness. You need to be meek. You need to be merciful, and so on. You need to be pure in heart. So we have a litmus test, so to speak. And a litmus test is our life experience. And the more we know about the nature of God, the more we can hold our life up to the litmus test of God's nature and say, does what I think, does what I do bring more of God's nature to my life? Do I experience more love? Do I love my neighbor more? Do I feel more peace? Do I experience more and help others experience more of God's nature, more equality, more justice, and so on? So without, what I learned in philosophy is you can make a great argument for just about anything if you're really good at it, if you're really good at arguing. But take a step back from arguments. Take a step back from the surface level stuff. Use Jesus' litmus test. The more we discover about the nature of God, the more we can judge the tree by its fruit. Judge our lives, our sense of what's true, based on God's nature and how well that's playing out for us. We say we believe in God, but we don't love, that we don't love everybody, etc. With meekness, we can look back and we can grow. And we all have to do that. None of us is perfect on that yet. So our daily prayer is about that meek looking again at the nature of God, to hone our litmus test and live it and make mistakes and try again and hone some more, To call this a science of Christ is to say that it's beyond dogma and creed. It's just about the simple stuff Jesus said and how we live, and how that plays out. Hopefully that's useful. Someone has written, when you were sharing the story about the family healed of flu symptoms, was the family that they were staying with affected by the prayer? And if not, why? It's a good question. My understanding from what I remember is that the family was kind of on the mend. The mom didn't talk about it a lot the next day. I think because that family was sort of coming out the other side of it. And so there wasn't like a concern in the family at that point. They were already starting to feel better. So that's what I remember of the story. So I can't answer you 100%. But what I remember for sure, I would say, is that there wasn't like, a bunch of people suffering in that household while they walked away and went, "Hey, we're great." I've experienced stuff like that sometimes before. That's not the highest form of prayer by any means. Salvation is not it's not about getting out while other people go down. Sometimes people look at spirituality that way, as kind of just transcending and leaving it all behind. But the nature of Christ is actually to be the leaven in the lump. It's not, how do I feel better while everybody else suffers? It's, how does this uplift all? Because you can't say something's true just for me. Doesn't work like that. 7 and 3 is 10 for me. Still 73 for those guys, and they're suffering from it. If we've genuinely discovered that it's 10, then we can't help but see that it's 10 for others. And the kind of grace, that kind of unearned love that we feel informing us and saving us from the suffering of the 73, so to speak, also just compels us. When we feel that loved, that love creates an overflow in us, and it lights our hearts on fire. It makes us want to make sure everyone else feels that too, which is not to say everyone's going to feel that by going and trying to convince them to see things as you do. But for us in our prayers, especially, to embrace everybody. And then from that standpoint, ask, what can I do? What does a wise, loving, discerning point of view do to inform me of the best way to help people right now? Meet people where they are. Hopefully that's helpful. Somebody has asked the question, how do justice and forgiveness relate? I'll just answer with what comes to me now. I'm sure this is a broad discussion. But first thing is, I think that forgiveness doesn't have to mean, and actually it's just not about letting what is false go unaddressed. Forgiveness is about that love that is not about punishment. It's about progress. The mistake, the misperception, the 73 causes suffering. So it's not that, like, let's say we believe 7 and 3 is 73, and then God punishes us for believing that. You're wrong, I'm going to punish you. Or I'll forgive you. And then, that's not what we're talking about. God is truth and knows only truth. It's the misperception that causes the suffering. But until that misperception is corrected, there will still be suffering. Forgiveness on the part of one another is to see first and foremost that the mistake, the misperception, does not define us. It never got beneath the surface into our true character and true being. It is to start from the basis of what is true and to love that person, and to do that for ourselves, because Many times when we have our own condemning thoughts saying we're not good enough, we don't know enough, we've made a big mistake or whatever. And it's actually even harder, I think, sometimes for many of us to take that step back and go, even when I have all the information in the world to say I really messed up right there, I have this God-given right. It's not a right that I earned by what I did. If that were possible, I would have lost it a long time ago. But it is this unchangeable right that is built into my spiritual DNA to know myself more as God knows me, because that causes change, because that overturns what is false. And so the forgiveness that starts with what is true and works out from that basis forgives based on the fact that it, at the same time, is simultaneously tearing down what is causing suffering. It doesn't allow it to continue. So there is a way to be full of grace and love and hold what is false accountable for the purpose of progressing and moving forward, not for the purpose of condemning or attaching a mistake or a misperception to anybody's true nature. And then that's justice. Justice is when what is true is seen and meted out, when what is normal and natural, our right to be whole and free, is experienced by everybody, not just by some people, but by everybody, both the person who was the victim as well as the person who is the victimizer. Both effectively need to be set free from the lie that was kind of victimizing them both by turning them into these roles. The lie is destroyed by what is true. That's justice. I hope that helps. We're coming up on 9 o'clock. It looks like we have 2 more questions. I'll touch on those and then we'll wrap up. Somebody here, let me just learning how to look at these questions the right way. How would you suggest listening to news of violent behavior, such as what we saw at the Capitol, so as to be able to pray constructively for change and not just seeking personal peace? Such a good question. All of these are so good. Thank you. What I love most is that you're not just asking about how do I feel good myself, but really are building on our theme of how we better our world. It is true that sometimes when we take a step back and pray and we maybe especially if our circumstances around us are comfortable, it can be easy enough to just only do the first part, the take a step back part. And that's not enough. It's not, when you face the world again, it's all still going to be there. Just because you stepped back from it doesn't mean you really did anything. It just meant you feel better. Taking a step back and feeling a personal peace is a starting point, not an ending point. That's the point where we begin to be able to think more clearly and constructively about what is true, to discover more about what is true. When we feel so loved in our lives, that we were sort of talking about this before, it should impel us, and actually just does. It's not like if you're a nice person, it'll do this. It's like we can't help it. When we feel as loved as we really are by God, it just ignites us to want to help everybody feel that love. That should be the catalyst that gets us beyond just wanting personal peace. Love should be the catalyst. It's the only thing that really works. Self-determination and willpower it doesn't sustain us. But then that should send us deeper. It should send us asking questions. How do I reconcile what I'm seeing? How do I engage with what I'm reading here and in a way that allows that to speak to me, to convince me, to lift me up, to show me something new that makes me go, okay. And not just once in a while, but if we care enough about our brothers and sisters around the world, we realize this is part of our purpose for being. Remember, we're here for the glory of God. Well, this glory is not compartmentalized. It compels us to want to discover more. and not just take what we've discovered before and love it and think on it and that kind of stuff, but really get into it, get those detailed and we know it when we feel them. We talk about that litmus test. As we're discovering what we need to know about God's nature in any given moment. This is not about taking on the burdens of the world. It's actually about putting the burdens down at the feet of truth and love and letting truth and love speak to us in a way that gives us a direct, detailed, useful response. And we judge that tree by its fruit in our prayer. Have I discovered what I need to today? I know it by the way it makes me feel. It's more than a personal feeling of fulfillment or something. It's that feeling of light embracing the whole world, and then ideas about how to think in the next moment and how to act and so forth. So sometimes we can mistake that personal piece for having gone far enough, but we can always put the question back out there to God. What else do I need to know? If there's this niggling thought that we feel like we're trying to shut out, that the world is suffering, we can go back to God and say, what do you want me to know about that right now? I don't have to know all of it, but I know there's something right now that I can know, that I can discover. It becomes a habit, a way of living in relationship with God. And it doesn't feel like a burden. It actually feels like every time we discover something new, we feel lighter. We feel more loved. We feel the world more safe than we realized it was the day before or the hour before we prayed. One last question here. Somebody asked, what are a couple of ways you have found helpful to pray about government? It's good. I would say something that's important is that each of us is going to have our own things that, strike us or concern us or draw our attention in any domain. So when we look at government, I can say, here's things that have helped me in my prayers, but that's going to relate to the stuff that has come niggling at me, right? And I'm going to share it with you, but I just want to say that it's not, okay, that guy said that, so I should go do that. What we're talking about is a method that is not telling somebody what to do or think, but exploring a way to think for ourselves more, to discover what God is telling us more that meets the thoughts as they come to us, the views that we have about things. So we can all do that, and it's going to be better than anything anyone else is, going to tell you. But for me, in the last few days, especially, I've been thinking about, well, one of the questions that somebody asked is how to, when it seems like people are so divided, what gives you any sense that our truth could ever get to their truth, or that their, how we even know what's true, that kind of stuff. That's a question that has perplexed me too. And so when I think about our government, I've thought about what we talked about how there's this bigger truth that is really governing here, that we're not waiting. People tend to wait for the person they believe in the most. You may be someone who feels that the person who's going to be inaugurated tomorrow is a hopeful move forward for you. You may feel like it's the opposite direction, and that you have to wait 4 years, to hopefully have someone that you can trust in more. But either side of that, we really have the same thing to do. We lose out if we feel like, oh, good, someone I like is there now, just as much as we lose out when we feel like, oh, the person or the people that I think would really care for the stuff I care about aren't there now. What is the real power? What is the real source of information? The next thought that'll come for me after I think about, oh, okay, so the real power is not a person, it's a principle. It's a principle that's constant. It's not transitioning. It is already there. It is already governing and guiding. It is already responsible for all the good that I care about and all the domains of government. Is not rooted in the various personalities and how smart they might be or how good they might be. The next thing that comes, of course, is, but how do you know that's going to connect? How do you know that seems so divorced from these people? And then thinking about, well, where do they get their ideas? Where do they get their true character? Where do they get their true mind? Those are ideas that have been really helpful to me recently. I know there's others in more specific domains of thought, but hopefully that's helpful for you. Well, we're going to wrap up. We're right at 9 o'clock now. So thank you so much. I'm going to read you two quick quotes and then just kind of sign off here. The first one is from the Bible, and we're back with Paul again here in the Bible. A very short phrase in the book of 2 Corinthians. He writes, "See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation." Now, the temptation, of course, is, as we were saying, is to think that it's a day away, it's a year away, salvation being the fruition of that good, that discovery that nothing can separate us from good, from God's grace. But now, now is the promise. Those who are discovering that are proving it. Paul was proving it as he talked to these people, helped these people, healed these people based on what he learned and saw modeled and signified in the life of Jesus. Now is the time, is the promise. Now is always going to be, right now is the moment we can take the step we need to. We can't be put to sleep to that. We can't be made to forget and get caught up in the swell of, the surface level views of things. Right now is a much better promise than even the greatest surface level promise. Right? Much better. Right now is the day of salvation. Right now is when we can discover. And then the thing about God's nature is it's infinite, so there's always more to discover. But right now we can discover all of what we need to know right now. And that's how we keep moving. And then this is from Mary Baker Eddy's book, Science and Health. Again, she writes, "It's possible, yea, it's the duty and privilege of every child, man, and woman to follow in some degree the example of the Master by the demonstration of truth and life, of health and holiness." It's built into us. This is not big stuff that's beyond us. Our ability to understand, our ability to pray is not something we have to get right first, and then God will be there waiting with all this great truth and grace. It is who we are. All of it is grace. All of it is unearned. Anything that makes us feel like I have to do X before is no. We can take a step back even from that in our own prayers. What defines our ability to do good and know good and discover what's true is also freely given. Your nature is freely given. The light of God shines through you. Jesus said, "You are the light of the world," and you are. And I'm just so grateful you've been willing to join tonight to think through these things. Your questions just indicate how caring you are, and I'm grateful to be part of it with you and making my own discoveries right along with you. Thanks so much for being here tonight and for all your prayers going forward. Take care.